It feels like I was on this side last week. I'm seeing some nods, but the guys in the back told me I was on the other side. So I don't know. It feels a little odd to me. I try to go back and forth because I'm kind of a flip-flopper that way, and yet here I am on this side tonight. So if I am on the wrong side, apologies to you guys over there, although you may like me better over here. All right, so this section is kind of the climax of Paul's argumentation in Galatians. And so this is the main appeal of the letter and the time when he is going to say, in my opinion, most clearly what he's really been driving toward throughout what we've studied so far. So remember, and I'll just remind you, I know we've talked about this each week that we've studied this, Paul has been arguing, and especially in the section we've just covered, that Christ has liberated us, and us includes both Jew and Gentile, from the law. And that has different manifestations depending on if you came from Judaism or came from a Gentile background. But either way, what Christ has done is to redeem us from the law and to set us free. So that is the background of what we're going to read today. I want to read, so we're going to divide this into a couple of sections. I want to start just by reading verses 1 to 6. It says, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. You are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from grace. For through the Spirit, by faith, we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love." All right, so verse 1 says, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." So the idea here is, if you've gone through all this process of being free, being liberated, think of a slave being redeemed. He used that language in chapter 4. Or think of this comparison we just had of Hagar, the slave woman and her slave children, versus Sarah and Isaac, the free children, the children of promise. So you've got the freedom now. You don't want to go back to the slavery, and that's the idea. Christ set us free so that we can be free. That's the point. The point is now that you can live free. It is not just about the process by which you're set free and then you go back to slavery. Paul argues this way in Romans 6 also, where he talks about you were a slave of sin, but you've been set free, and now you can become slaves of righteousness. Now you can serve someone that's worth serving. So don't go back to a yoke of slavery. I put verses here that talk about the liberation that Paul has in mind. I just want to keep you in mind. We've been reading about this over and over and over again. This is sort of his so what statement. Don't go back to a yoke of slavery. If Jesus died to set you free, then be free. Don't be enslaved again. So if so much has been done to redeem and free you, how can you go back? Paul also claims that Torah is a yoke. That's the word he uses here in verse 1, a yoke of slavery. This might ring a bell in Acts 15, where Peter is in Jerusalem and he's talking with the other apostles about this issue, this question, do the Gentiles have to be circumcised and keep the law? And Peter says, why would we put on the neck of the disciples a yoke that neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear? I think there is so much in that statement. As a Jewish man, Peter is the one who says, I have never eaten anything common or unclean. That's Peter. He has lived his whole life that way, and yet he says, serving God this way is a yoke that I haven't been able to bear, and neither have our fathers. I think in the same way Paul describes it in Romans 7, where he says, I want to do the right thing, but I don't do the right thing because all I get from the law is condemnation. It just says I'm not good enough. It doesn't ever set me free. It doesn't ever empower me to do right. It just says wrong, 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 wrong. And you know what that feels like. I think even in our time, we have that experience sometimes. When you're told you're wrong, wrong, wrong all the time, every day, it has an effect on you. It's a yoke. It's a burden that you can't bear. You can never live up to the law. So he says, Peter says, why are we giving them a yoke? Here, Paul says, don't go back to a yoke of slavery. And I put Matthew 11 in there. You remember Jesus says, take my yoke and learn from me. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. Not a yoke that you can't bear, not a yoke of slavery, but a different idea, a different sort of work. Okay, so this next section, verses 2 to 6, I kind of lump all together. I know there's a paragraph division in my version that has this all as one paragraph. What I want you to see as we go through this is that Paul is thinking that following Christ and following Torah are two different and mutually exclusive paths. And I think that's the way that it's easiest to understand this text, to say, look, these are two ways. You think that you follow Jesus by following Torah. And he says, no, when you follow Torah, you've left Jesus. He says, you think that this is the next step. I'm telling you it's a step away. So you need to see it as two different paths. And his language shows this. All right, so verse 2, look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. So first you've got this. This is the first time he overtly says that they are thinking about being circumcised. He has hinted at that and talked about circumcision in vague terms already in the letter. But this is the most direct statement. If you do this, Christ will be of no advantage to you. Verse 3, I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. So instead of freedom, remember that's our language in verse 1, instead of freedom, what does circumcision get you? In my version, the word is obligation. That's different from freedom, right? Freedom and obligation, not the same thing. You are obligated, verse 3, to keep the whole law. So I take that to be something like this. You better get busy and keep the whole law. All right, you want to be circumcised? Get after it. 613 commands. You better get started. And it'll never stop. You'll just keep trying to fulfill the law and keep the law. You are obligated now. You are putting yourself under obligation. You're wearing a yoke of slavery. That's what you're doing because you're leaving behind Jesus. I also want to say, the fact that he says in verse 3, he's obligated to keep the whole law, implies to me that that wasn't really what they were thinking about. That they were thinking about pieces of the law. And I just want to remind you, because people do this today, where there are parts of the law of Moses that are timeless and very attractive, and they make us think, wow, that's from God, that's awesome. And then there are parts of the law that we look at even today, and sometimes even Christians, and we say, wow, that's horrible, or that's barbaric, or I don't want to think about that, or I'm glad I don't have to do that one, right? Okay? But you don't get to pick and choose. That's what Paul's saying. If you're going to accept circumcision, you better get started keeping the whole law. It's a pass-fail test. You're going to do it all or not do it all, but you can't pick and choose and say, this, I want to do this and not the other. So I just want to warn us against that because let me say it this way. Let me come at it this way. I've heard this from people who want to justify practices I don't think are right. And they will go to the law of Moses and say, see, this is what they did or said back then. To which I say, well, that's not our law. But I have also heard my brethren say this and argue against things based on old law statements. And that troubles me. Okay, I'm talking about, I don't want to get sidetracked, but I'll just tell you plainly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, I have heard my brethren condemn wearing earrings and getting tattoos. I'm talking about males wearing earrings because for some reason it's different with females and males. Males wearing earrings, getting tattoos, and you say, well, how could you condemn that? And they'll go back to Leviticus. But we don't go to Leviticus for other things. We don't go to Leviticus for sacrifices. We don't go to Leviticus as our law. So to me, there's a consistency issue. We have to be able to say, look, that's just not our law. Is it from God? Yes. But that's not the way we're made right before God today. So we have to be able to say that inasmuch as we don't do that to follow other practices. And I'm thinking particularly about instrumental music when I talk about that because that's a justification often given for instruments. But if we're going to say no to that, we've got to say no to the other things. It's just that simple to me. So I don't really have an interest in getting all of that started. Here's what I want to say. Paul is arguing there is obligation that you don't get to pick and choose. And he wants them to know that because at least in part, they're not considering that. I wonder if they had their own pet laws or their own things that they thought were particularly appealing about the law. Like I want to do this, I want to do this, I like that. But there are other parts that, that's not really my interest. And Paul is saying, look, that's not the way the law works. Paul was a veteran of the law. He knew the law. He lived by the law. And you don't just pick and choose. All right, give me just a minute. I'll get to you guys that have comments. I want to get through verse 6 here. Verse 4, you are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from grace. All right, so he said in verse 2, Christ will be of no advantage to you if you are circumcised. Here he says, you are severed from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. I'm tying that together with the statement he made back in 2:21. If righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. He says, I do not nullify the grace of God. This is an idea that I think is a little bit challenging because we use the term fall from grace a little differently than I think Paul means it. It's kind of become a saying in our time. You know, fall from grace, not just in a religious context, just sort of like a fall. You know, and so we'll say, oh, well, this president had a scandal and he fell from grace. You know, that idea. I don't think that's what Paul means. I think it's very intentionally specific about the idea of grace. So let me do my best to explain this. And again, if I miss the mark or if I'm not clear enough, y'all let me know. I think that the point here is that if we're going to keep the law, we're saving ourselves by our own work rather than Christ saving us, or grace, through an atoning sacrifice. That's two paths, right? One path is saying, you know what, Jesus, don't you worry about that. You don't need to die. I got this. I'm going to keep this law. I'm going to be righteous. And then someday I'll stand before God and he'll say, well, congratulations, Jacob, you were righteous. Come on in. That's, he says, what you are doing when you say, I want to keep the law. Or, in Paul's language, I want to be saved by the works of the law. That's the same idea. I'm good enough. I'll make it on my own. I don't need grace. I don't need a gift. Don't bother dying for me. Don't need it. Now, Paul has already said back in chapter 2 and verse 21, if that's possible, if righteousness were possible through the law, then Christ died in vain. There was no reason. I mean, we didn't need him. We could have done it on our own. And if you didn't do it, it was on you. But he says that's not possible. Again, the reason we've gone over time and time again in this class is because the law has to be kept perfectly, and we're just not perfect. So they don't realize it, but their desire to keep Torah puts salvation back in their own hands and eliminates their need for Jesus. So think about that. I don't need you, Jesus. I don't need your grace, God. I got it. That's what you're saying. You're saying, yes, I accepted this. I'm so thankful Jesus died for me, but you know what? I'm gonna take it from here. I got it. And you just, you keep your grace and I'll take care of me. And I don't think they realize they're saying that, but that's what Paul is arguing they're saying. So here, falling from grace is less about doing evil. That's usually what we think of and what we mean when we talk about falling from grace. Even in our circles in religious time, we'll say, how do we fall from grace, or how can a Christian fall from grace? And we kind of use that as a blanket term. This is what that's specifically talking about. It's talking about disconnecting yourself from the grace of God. I don't need your grace. I can handle it myself. It's more about pursuing our salvation without Jesus' sacrifice. So he is saying, watch out. You don't realize you're cutting yourself off from Christ. You're severed from Christ. You're fallen from grace. You're nullifying the grace of God. You're doing something you don't realize, and it's not the direction you want to go. So I think that's the meaning here of falling from grace. Now, if we're talking about the broader topic of can we fall out of God's favor or lose our salvation, or however you want to frame that, the answer to that is yes, biblically. And there are a number of different scenarios that we could go to. But when we're talking about Galatians and we're talking about how do you fall from grace, I think we have to say this is what the context indicates, that it's about this taking salvation as our own responsibility. Okay, verse 5. For through the Spirit, by faith, we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. All right, so rather than being righteous in ourselves, we eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. By faith, we wait for it. And I believe the connection here is we're hoping of his righteousness. That's one of Paul's favorite phrases, to talk about the righteousness of God. How the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. Or he talks about how there is a righteousness that comes not because we work our way to it and we say, this is my righteousness, but it is instead given to us like the forgiveness God gives David in Romans 4, or the faith that Abraham has that is just counted as righteousness, even though it's not. That righteousness, that idea of being right with God, is not something we have on our own. It's not something we earn or deserve. Do you know what we call it when we think we have righteousness on our own? We call it being self-righteous. That's actually condemned in Scripture. Jesus talks about those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. And he tells that parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke 18. So that's the idea, I believe, here. Instead of being righteous in ourselves, we're waiting for his righteousness. And Philippians 3 seals the deal for me, where Paul says, I want not my own righteousness, but the righteousness of God that comes through faith. That's what I'm seeking. That's what I'm after. Also, I want you to notice in verse 5 the Spirit, through the Spirit, because that's going to be very important later in this chapter. Not really what we'll get to tonight, but next week, Lord willing. The Spirit is a sign that Christ is in us. The Spirit is an answer to the law. And the Spirit is the guide to following God's will in the new age. I suspect that these Judaizers are saying, you know what, if there's no law, people are just going to go crazy and do whatever they want. And Paul's answer to that is not, no, there'll be a new, better law. That's not his answer in Galatians. His answer is, no, God's people will follow God's Spirit. And when they walk in the Spirit, there is no need for a law. They will do what God's Spirit leads them to do, the fruit of the Spirit. And he says at the end of the list of the fruit of the Spirit, you remember, against such things, there is no law. Nobody's worried about, oh, you're too loving, or you're too joyful, or you're too peaceful. It's instead something that naturally springs from those who are obedient to God through his Spirit. All right, verse 6. I know I told you all to hang on. I'm almost done with this section, but I want to get all of this out there, and then we'll kind of talk about it. Verse 6. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision count for anything, but only faith working through love. So when he says it doesn't count for anything, your version will have some different rendering there. I think what he means is basically it's not what brings righteousness. What we talked about in verse 5 about righteousness we're waiting on, we hope. Circumcision is not what brings it, or uncircumcision. What matters is faith working through love. Remember how much he's talked about faith, how Gentiles receive the promise, the inheritance of Abraham through faith, because we're faithful like Abraham was faithful, not because we're good enough. I want you to also notice that grace is not antithetical to work. Antithetical is a big word. It means they don't go together. Okay? Grace and work do go together. You see that in verse 6. Faith working through love. So Paul is not saying if you ever do anything, suddenly you've hijacked your salvation and you're trying to save yourself. He is saying instead, a response to God's grace is going to mean that we are obedient and we love other people, and so our faith acts in love. Our faith works. Our faith obeys. That's the way Paul thinks of this, not as if they're opposites, but instead the order is what's important. Okay. I don't know what I'm trying to say there. Y'all know what I'm trying to say? No? It seems the Judaizers taught that these Christians would receive something if they were circumcised. Paul argues the opposite. I think what I'm trying to get at there is that these things don't matter. They don't count for anything. Maybe they thought they would. Maybe this would be the key to their spiritual future. You know, if you just do this one thing, you just get circumcised, you start keeping Torah, and everything will fall into place. And he says, no, neither one of those things matter. Circumcision, uncircumcision, God doesn't care about that. All right, so I've talked a lot. Any thoughts you guys have on verses 1 to 6? I know I cut some off when we were talking about tattoos and whatnot, but we can open that can of worms up if y'all want. But I reserve the right to close it back up. Yeah, Miss Trish?
Even Orthodox Jews cannot keep all of the law, because I doubt if any of them have stoned their disobedient children.
Right.
And so if they couldn't do it back then, they can't do it now.
Right.
And why would they even want to try when grace is so freely given with very limited obligations as far as what we can't do, with so many pluses on it?
Right. Absolutely. And we could talk about a number of different laws that Either it's impossible to keep because the temple has been destroyed, or however you can go through all that. But the basic posture of the law being a yoke, I think, is still very powerful. Yeah, Brother Mike?
Yeah. They even from the beginning, there were laws, there were rules of some sort. Even before the law, there was a law. And even now, New Testament teaches that by nature we do some things. I mean, Romans talks about the Gentiles doing things by nature that are in fact part of the law, and that nature itself teaches that it's, for a man to have long hair, all this kind of stuff. I've struggled. I've always said there's a difference in right and wrong. Just because it's legal doesn't make it right, and just because it's not in the law doesn't make it wrong. I mean, there is a difference in right and wrong, and somehow or another, we have to make arrangements to tolerate that. Not just on circumcision, on everything else. There's a difference in right and wrong.
Right. And we need that definition of this is right and this is wrong. Law is very effective for that. And I just want to keep hammering this. The law will condemn. The law will identify sin, but the law can't change a heart. And that's no law. Man's law, God's law. No law changes hearts. That's something that has to be a work God does. And so I think that's part of why God is deciding we need something different. That the law is not good for our failings. But yes, in our time, there are still things. In fact, it's going to be kind of shocking in a minute. After all this talk about law, do you know what Paul appeals to when he tells them how to live? He says, all the law is summed up in one word: love your neighbor as yourself. Paul, I thought we were anti-law. But what he's getting at is there's something here. It's not about, keeping the law of Moses and keeping all the covenant. It's instead about this is just how you live. This is how you need to live. And I think that's where he's headed with the idea of the Spirit teaching us to be different people, teaching us to treat people in a different way. Somebody else have a hand? Yeah, Aaron?
So I'm glad you brought up the point about, the law can't change hearts. And I really think that's at the very beginning of 5, whenever Paul says, for freedom Christ has set us free. I think that's really what that point is. That I like to think of freedom as your heart is going before your actions, as opposed to someone laying out a whole bunch of actions that you're supposed to follow, whether your heart's into it or not. And all the times that I've received the most joy in a spiritual sense of moving and acting was whenever I had been reading and studying and growing and decided this is what I wanted to do, whatever I did next. As opposed to when someone comes and says, hey, you need to do this, and that's a different kind of experience altogether. And then in regards to why keeping the law, I kind of think about it sometimes in terms of Lost. Remember the Lost episodes and how there were all these elaborate storylines and plots, and at the very end you go, half of those weren't even important. And I think sometimes in regards to the law, it's such a large thing, and we think, well, surely it still matters and counts for something today.
Yep. And maybe there's more to it than what we see and know, but I do think you're right. If you follow the main storyline, it gets you to Jesus, which is the point of it all, and kind of sums it all up, especially when he says, I've come to fulfill the law, so that he is what the law was intended to produce. I like your point, too, about, when you're saying that, I'm thinking of the things that we do freely, the things that we do of our own free will. And there's a world of difference between being forced to do something and doing it because you want to do it. And we all know that. We've all experienced that. Those of us who have children, we've seen that both ways, hopefully. And there is some truth to that God wants to set our hearts free so that we choose to serve Him instead of the way we kind of choose to. Well, I don't even know. If you're a slave to sin, I'm not sure how much you choose it at that point. Maybe an initial choice that leads you down that path. Yeah, Brother Kyle?
Well, I just remember that in Romans, the 10th chapter, where in the 9th and 10th chapters where he is wishing almost that the Jews would come to the truth. He says they have a zeal for God, but it's not according to knowledge. And so that's what's going on here, that Christ has laid down a base of knowledge that is different in the sense of where justification is, which the law didn't have. And he says that they have a zeal for God, but they don't understand his righteousness, and they don't have his righteousness because they don't have it according to knowledge. And so here the Judaizers are introducing a foundation which will lead them astray and right back to where they sit now. Those Judaizers sit.
Yep.
And it's just a beautiful passage, brethren. My heart's desire and my prayer for God is for their salvation. For I testify about them, they have a zeal for God. That's what you're doing when you want to practice something that you like from the old law. But it's not according to knowledge. For not knowing about God's righteousness, what a condemnation. And seeking to establish their own. That's what they did. They set up their own laws because the law that they faced was so rigorous in condemning them for their sin. They found other ways to measure themselves among themselves and not submitting themselves to the righteousness of God.
Right.
So he's saying the same thing in Galatians that he said about the Jews.
That, as you say that, that's what I'm thinking is verse 3 there, where they're trying to establish their own righteousness. It's about them, instead of it being about, I'm going to follow God's. And God's righteousness came in a different form than they were expecting, and so it was something they rejected. Yeah, Brother Dick?
I'm struck by this verse 6, always saying to me, in Christ Jesus, the only thing that matters is faith working through love, that underlined in my book. Makes me think of John 6:29, the works of God. What are the works of God? Believe in him who was sent. I think, at least and I think a lot of people I can call to mind in my memory, tend to dabble in faith and love. But there are parts of that we're kind of comfortable with, and we don't really have a grip, I think, on the depth of what God in heaven means by having faith, by believing. Believing is not just turning to the person next to you and say, this is what I think, this is what I believe. You know, it's a total immersion in who a person is, and I think we very often fall short of that. Mm-hmm. And I just think it's a good admonition for us to be reminded how serious a thing this is in God's mind, for me to have faith and to have love and let those work together in God's economy.
Honestly, it may be a little easier to be circumcised, right? Some bodily thing, some physical action, as opposed to a life lived by. Mm-hmm. All right, well, good thoughts, everybody. I appreciate that. I'm going to keep moving here. Let's start in verse 7. I'm going to read down through verse 15. It says, "You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion is not from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. I wish that those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. For you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another." Okay, this section, especially 7 to 12, is a little, I almost feel like Paul's kind of saying, and another thing, like little bursts, and they're kind of related, but they don't flow the way his argumentation has been flowing. So verse 7, "You are running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion is not from him who calls you." So the teachers that have come to you, they have not helped you, have not enlightened you, they have hindered you. And he says, you were doing so well. You ever have that feeling like everything was going great, and now you've gone and done this? What were you thinking? This desire and this teaching, he said, this persuasion is not from him who calls you. I find that statement actually very strong. This doesn't come from God. So you shouldn't be believing it. It shouldn't be troubling you. It shouldn't be what you're considering. It's not from God. You listen to God. He's the one who called you. So how are you listening to these people who are not speaking to you from God? Remember, Paul has gone through this elaborate proof that he is speaking for God back in chapters 1 and 2. All right, verse 9. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. I think we've heard that before, right? Leaven is very often an influence picture. And so Paul is concerned about the influence and spread of this thinking that something is missing and insufficient. You're not enough as you are. You need something more. You're not enough to have the Spirit. You're not enough to be a follower of Jesus. You're not enough to have hope of eternal life. No, you need something more. Do you ever feel that? I think that's how 90% of Christian books are sold. Hey, something's missing. You don't have enough. Just buy this and I'll tell you what it is. Something missing. You don't have it. And that spirit is contagious. We all start to get a little restless and complaining. After all, Paul says we're groaning because we're waiting for what's to come. We're not there yet. And so we have this feeling like I want something better, but then that might lead us to leave behind what we do have. That's the warning here. Or maybe the thinking is that we need to save ourselves by keeping the law. Whatever the thinking is, Paul says, I'm worried that it's going to spread like leaven. A little leaven spreads through the lump. Verse 10, I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. So a couple of things about that. Paul is confident. I love it when he does this. My favorite is at the beginning of 1 Corinthians. You guys know 1 Corinthians is a letter to a church that's a mess. And they got so many problems, but he talks about how confident he is in them. And I think, how could you be confident in these guys? They look like they've gotten everything wrong. Here he says he has spent almost 5 chapters chewing them out. And he says, now I'm confident you'll take this well, and that you'll agree with me and everything will be fine. I'm confident about that, that you'll take no other view. And he's also confident there will be a penalty or a judgment for the teachers. He says that he will bear the penalty. The word is actually judgment. Remember Matthew 18:7? You guys remember the passage that talks about whoever causes one of these little ones to stumble? Be better, millstone were tied around his neck and he were thrown in the depths of the sea. It's a horrible picture. But it's a statement of don't trouble people who are coming to Jesus. Don't get in their way. Don't cause them to sin. And now you've got people that are doing that very thing, leading them away from Jesus. And so I don't think it's too strong language to say he will bear his judgment or his penalty. Verse 11, oh, by the way, also that little phrase at the end of verse 10, whoever he is, means that Paul probably didn't know who these people were, or at least doesn't seem to know them personally. Verse 11, but if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. This is my and another thing. So probably somebody's going around saying that Paul does preach circumcision, that he was still preaching that Jews should be circumcised or something like that. So I'm preaching circumcision to them and not to you, that kind of thing. But he just says, I deny that, especially because, remember, the main source of Paul's persecution was fellow Jews. So if he's going around and telling fellow Jews, hey, it's fine that you're circumcised, why would they persecute him? Where would the problem be? He is saying part of the persecution I'm receiving has to do with a message I'm preaching that says Gentiles don't need to be circumcised. They don't need to keep Torah. So if that's why I'm being persecuted, then you should know that I'm not preaching that. All right, verse 12. I wish that those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. So that is a shocking statement. I don't know how your version has it. Mutilate is some versions. Castrate is really the idea. It's kind of a gruesome pun on circumcision. I think I would say it's full of righteous frustration. You can tell Paul is frustrated with what he is saying and frustrated with dealing with them. I put Philippians 3:2 where he says, beware of the mutilation. Mutilation is a really ugly way to describe circumcision. It's a way of saying they're just cutting their bodies. That's all that is going on there. Now, castration in particular was a Gentile thing. Uh-oh. There we go. Castration was a Gentile phenomenon. And so what that at least suggests, and I'm not saying that we go all the way with the implications of this, but I think we should at least point them out. This language suggests that Paul views circumcision as no different from pagan mutilations. Now, remember, the pagans would castrate people and make them eunuchs, and those people, according to the law, were not allowed to be a part of the assembly, really were sort of second-class citizens in Judaism and kind of apart from God. So for Paul to equate those two things, the sign of the covenant of Abraham and the Gentile mutilation that made you unclean in the law is a bit shocking. You can see his frustration. You can see what he's thinking, but I don't know what more to do than that. I think what's a little bothersome, troubling about it is that it sounds a little vindictive, like he is angry in a way that seems inappropriate. This verse has always struck me as a little, like maybe Paul's language got away from him, that kind of thing. But I don't know that I have the right to say something like that. That's just my impression. So that's what I would say about the statement. Verse 13, for you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So verse 13 is a really important idea. I mentioned earlier there was probably an accusation that if you take the law away, people will just go crazy. And so here it is. Yes, we're supposed to be free, but what does freedom mean? Well, freedom doesn't mean you can just do whatever you want and serve yourself. So he says that specifically. Do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Peter says in 1 Peter 2, don't use your liberty as a cloak for vice. You hear that? No, I'm free. Don't say anything to me about that. I'm free. I can do what I want. Or as the Corinthians said, all things are lawful for me. It's fine. It's fine. Or in Romans, can we continue in sin that grace may abound? That idea is throughout the New Testament because that was a concern. And he says that's not what freedom means. Freedom doesn't mean you do whatever you want and God doesn't care. Instead, freedom means, and I like the way Aaron put it, we now have the ability to choose to do what God calls us to do and to freely serve other people and serve God. So he says, through love, serve one another. And then he says in 14, the whole law is fulfilled in one word, love your neighbor as yourself. So I would say it this way, we're still bound to the goal of the law, love your neighbor as yourself, but we now do this freely as we follow the Spirit. In 6:2, he's going to say, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, right? Wow, isn't it shocking that he's using law like he is after all the diatribe against law? He is saying, God still has things he wants you to do and be. It's just that they're not contained in Torah. So, law-free people, in Paul's mind, are not intended to be sinful and uninhibited. They are to be loving and giving. We're free to do that now in a way that we weren't before. Okay, verse 15, but if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. This is a picture of animals tearing each other apart. And the language intensifies bite and devour and consume is kind of a progression. So like animals biting, tearing, eating each other, there's danger in Christians forgetting to love one another. I think that's a really mild way to put it, that sometimes we forget to love each other, don't we? And in doing so, we bite and devour. Now, I want to plant this little seed in your mind because we'll need this next week. Given the fact that in the list of works of the flesh, Paul talks about rivalries, dissensions, and divisions, I think Paul's onto something here. I think he knows something's going on in the churches in Galatia. And so he is giving a warning. Whatever you hear about me talking about Torah and circumcision, don't think that this means you get to go around treating your brothers and sisters this way, arguing, dividing, attacking. It's not right. You don't need a law to tell you it's wrong. It's a work of the flesh. Okay, so we'll come back to that, and we'll have a lot to say about that type of thing next week. Jesus' followers can destroy one another and destroy his body, and Paul says that mentality is a lack of love. So remember, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything but faith working through love. Love is important here, because without love as a guide to that, then we can say, I believe and I'm going to do work, but I don't care about you. And if you're wrong or you get in my face, I'll be all over you, and we can bite and devour each other. And that's also not going to be what God intends after the law, as his people are walking by the Spirit. All right. How about this? I'll give you my applications, and if you guys have anything, I'll let you have the last minute. All right, so let's talk a little about application, something to take away. Okay, God wants us to be free, but freedom is not a license to do evil, which may enslave us again. Paul talks about this in Romans 6. You've been set free. Don't let sin reign in your mortal body to make you obey its lusts. But instead, present your members as members of righteousness, so that you can live in holiness. But there is always the possibility that even though we've been freed, we go back to slavery. We say, yeah, I want to do those things again and be that person again. So God wants us to be free. And that should be our goal, to be free from sin, to be free from the yoke. But it's not as if there's nothing wrong now and everything is open to us, because sin is still a reality. In fact, if anything, shouldn't those of us who have been set free from sin have the most fear of it? We know what's there. We've been down that road. We've been enslaved and we've been set free. I don't need to go back there to wonder how it tastes and what it feels like. I know. And that's the reason I'm not there anymore. So there is, in that freedom mentality, also a little bit of concern. I don't want to be that person I used to be. I don't want to give up what God has begun in me. I cannot save myself or trust in my own actions to save me. I need grace. I think we need to say this and remind ourselves of this. No matter how much we obey, no matter how good we become, no matter how mature we are, no matter how many years we have in the gospel, we are never good enough to save ourselves, and we cannot trust in what we do. We're not enough to save ourselves. I need grace. Grace means God forgives. Grace means God has offered a sacrifice to take away my sins, which I cannot take away on my own, and no amount of good living can take away a sin. I need grace, and I need to remember that, because you can hear the posture that produces. It's not about me being great. It is instead about me being a beggar, one in need, because I'm not good enough on my own. True faith works through love. True faith works. That's a consistent thread throughout the Bible. Faith works. Faith is not just an intellectual assent, the way we've kind of made it in our time. It is instead something that you can see in others because you see how they live and act and talk. A little leaven can leaven the whole lump, which means others influence me and I influence them. This is one of those truths that we all know, and yet sometimes we live as if we don't know it or as if we are immune from it. Sometimes we feel like we're immune from others' influences. Sometimes we forget that we have an influence and people are watching us, but both of those things are true. And the last one, Christians should act from love for each other, not biting and not devouring. There is a heart involved when we begin to clash with one another that is about me and what I want and what I like and what I need. And instead of showing love, I begin to try to take. James talks about where wars and fights come from our own desires within us because we're not seeking those things from God. So this is something that should be the rule in our churches, that we act from love and we expect love, and that biting and devouring are something we don't accept. All right, I think we're out of time. So any comments? Sorry. No, send me something. Send me an email or something, and we'll talk.